dirt packed under her fingernails. The platoon slept off a 3-day hump through the valley, snoring against peeling mud-brick walls. Not Edwards. Her fingers remained locked around the grip of her Mark 13 rifle. They thought she was losing her edge. By sunrise, they'd realize she saved their lives. Heat radiated from the walls of the compound, smelling of baked clay, goat dung, and sweat that had dried and re-wet a dozen times over. It was 1900 hours. The sun was finally dipping behind the jagged ridgeline of the Hindu Kush, casting long bruised shadows across the valley floor. Chief Petty Officer Sybil Edwards sat on an overturned plastic crate in the corner of the main room. She ran a brass brush over the bolt of her Mark 13 sniper rifle. Scrape, tap, wipe. She repeated the motion with mechanical precision. Her hands were scarred, the knuckles thick, the skin stained perpetually grey from carbon and desert dust. Across the room, Lieutenant Diesel Kessler tossed a half-eaten MRE pouch into a trash pile. He wiped his mouth with the back of a filthy sleeve. "You're going to strip the finish right off that bolt, Chief," Kessler said. His voice was raspy, throat coated in the same fine silt that coated everything else. Edwards didn't look up. "Sand gets everywhere, LT, you know that." "It's clean, Sybil. It was clean 2 hours ago." Kessler leaned back against his pack, stretching his legs out. His knees popped. "Stand down. Get some rack time. We have an 18-kilometer exfil tomorrow night. You're burning calories you don't have." Edwards finally paused. She looked at Kessler, then past him, scanning the faces of the 4 other men in the room. They were SEALs, Tier 1. They had survived selection, survived deployments in hellholes they couldn't name to their families. And right now, they were simply exhausted flesh. Petty Officer Brian Cooper was already asleep, his mouth hanging open, a thin line of drool cutting a track through the grime on his chin. She slammed the bolt back into the receiver. The metallic clack was loud in the quiet room. "I'll sleep," she said. "Good." Kessler pulled his watch cap down over his eyes. "Cooper has first watch on the roof. Hancock takes the second. Nobody shoots unless they're inside the wire." Edwards laid the long, heavy rifle across her lap. She didn't sling it. She didn't prop it against the wall like the others had done with their M4s. She swung her legs onto her cot, lay back, and pulled her sleeping bag up to her chest. The Mark 13 rested right beside her, heavy barrel resting on the canvas, the pistol grip pressed into her ribs. Her right hand slipped under the fabric, fingers resting naturally against the trigger guard. Hancock, a fresh-faced operator who had only been with the team for 6 months, paused while unlacing his boots. He stared at her. "You sleeping with that thing again?" Hancock asked. He tried to make it sound like a joke, but the fatigue in his voice flattened the delivery. "Rifle is your lifeline," Edwards muttered, closing her eyes. "It's a 20-pound lifeline," Hancock said, shaking his head. He looked over at Kessler, who was already half asleep. "She's paranoid," Hancock whispered to nobody in particular. 2 weeks out here and the chief is seeing ghosts." Edwards heard him. She always heard them. When she first made it through the pipeline, they had watched her like hawks, waiting for her to quit, waiting for her to slow them down. She hadn't. She had carried the same weight, shot the same scores, and bled the same blood. But acceptance didn't mean they understood her. They thought she pushed herself, because she still felt the need to prove something. They were wrong. She pushed herself because she knew how easily men died when they got comfortable. Silence descended on the compound, broken only by the shifting of bodies on canvas cots and the distant hollow wind howling down the mountain pass. Edwards lay perfectly still. The rifle against her ribs was cold, a piece of forged steel and machined aluminum. It wasn't a comfort blanket. It was a tool. She wasn't seeing ghosts. She was looking at the math. 3 days ago, they had hit a high-value target in a compound to the north. Since then, they had been moving south, breaking contact, navigating treacherous terrain to reach this exfil point. It had been too quiet. No trailing elements, no probing fire at night. The local Taliban forces were aggressive. They didn't just let an assault force walk away without a harassing action. The quiet wasn't a retreat. It was a perimeter. Edwards opened her eyes. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint moonlight bleeding through the slats of the wooden shutters. Cooper woke up with a groan, slapped his cheeks to wake himself up, grabbed his rifle, and climbed the wooden ladder to the roof for his watch. She lay there, listening. Usually the desert night had a rhythm, feral dogs barking in the distance, the wind rustling the scrub brush, the occasional crack of a rock splitting from a sudden drop in temperature. Tonight, the dogs were silent. Edwards slid her thumb over the safety of the Mark 13. She felt the click in her bones rather than hearing it. She didn't close her eyes again. She just waited, breathing shallow, slow breaths, matching her heartbeat to the silence of the valley. Midnight passed. Then 0100. The air grew frigid, biting through the uninsulated walls of the compound. Edwards lay in the dark. The metal of the rifle had warmed to her body temperature. Beside her, Kessler snored, a low, rhythmic rumble. Hancock was grinding his teeth. At 0145, Edwards heard the sound. It wasn't a footstep. It wasn't a voice. It was the sound of a pebble rolling down a dirt incline. A tiny, insignificant sound. But rocks didn't move on their own, and the wind wasn't strong enough to dislodge anything larger than sand. She slid out of her sleeping bag. She didn't make a sound, no rustling nylon, no creaking cot. Years of moving through dense brush and hostile structures had taught her exactly how to carry her weight. She picked up the Mark 13. The heavy suppressor added length and awkwardness, but she moved it through the cramped room with practiced ease. She bypassed the ladder Cooper had used. Instead, she moved to the rear window, a narrow slit cut into the thick mud wall. She peered out into the darkness. Nothing, just black shapes of boulders and the sloping dirt of the hillside. She raised her rifle and looked through the thermal optic. The screen flickered to life in a faint, muted grey. Through the lens, the world was completely different. The rocks were cool, dark silhouettes. The ground was slightly warmer, holding onto the day's sun. And then she saw them, 300 yards out, moving slowly, methodically, white-hot silhouettes creeping down the hillside. They were low to the ground, using the natural depressions in the terrain to mask their approach. They weren't an undisciplined militia. They were moving in a staggered column, covering each other. 1, 2, 4, 8. Edwards swept the optic to the left. 6 more. She swept to the right. 5 more, including 2 carrying something long and heavy. A recoilless rifle or an RPG launcher. 19 men. They had bypassed the main valley road and climbed the steep ridges, moving into position to surround the compound. They hadn't fired yet because they were waiting to get within point-blank range to overwhelm the SEALs in their sleep. Edwards lowered the rifle an inch. She thought about waking Kessler. If she woke the team, there would be noise. Boots on wood, the clatter of gear, voices. The enemy was close enough to hear that shift in the compound's atmosphere. If the enemy realized they were made, they wouldn't creep anymore. They would open up with everything they had, RPGs, machine guns, grenades. The mud walls would stop small arms, but they wouldn't survive a rocket barrage. The team would be pinned, scrambling in the dark, She had to break their assault before it started. She had to take away their momentum and their leadership. Edwards moved silently away from the window. She crept to the ladder. She didn't climb it. Instead, she found a structural gap where the mud roof met the wall. A small, uneven firing port, barely wider than her rifle's barrel. She slid the suppressor through the gap. She shoved her pack under the rifle to support the bipod. She settled in. The concrete floor was freezing against her knees. She didn't feel it. Her world shrank to the rubber cup of the eyepiece. She found the group on the right, the two men with the heavy weapon. They were the biggest threat. If they got a rocket into the compound, it was over. She tracked the lead man. He was crawling, his heat signature bright against the cold earth. Distance, roughly 280 yards. Wind, negligible in the depression. Elevation, slightly downhill. Edwards placed the reticle on the center of the white-hot mass. She exhaled. Her lungs emptied. Her heartbeat slowed. In the space between beats, her finger applied 3 pounds of pressure to the trigger. Pfft! The suppressor swallowed the boom of the .300 Winchester Magnum round, turning it into a harsh hiss, like a massive tire suddenly deflating. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. She absorbed the recoil, immediately driving her eye back into the scope, working the bolt in a blur. The spent brass casing ejected, bouncing silently onto her pack. Through the thermal, she watched the lead man drop flat. Not a tactical prone. Dead weight. The man next to him, the one carrying the tube, stopped. He turned his head, clearly confused. He hadn't heard a loud gunshot. He just saw the man beside him collapse. Pfft! Edwards sent the second round right through his chest. The white-hot signature folded over the launch tube. Still, the alarm wasn't raised. The suppressed rounds were masking the origin of the fire. And in the pitch black, the enemy couldn't see their comrades falling until they bumped right into them. She shifted her aim to the center group. They were closer now, 200 yards. She found a man gesturing with his hands. The squad leader. Pfft! The leader fell backward, sliding down the dirt embankment. Now, panic set in. Through the thermals, Edwards saw the erratic movements. The disciplined crawl vanished. Signatures scrambled behind rocks. They knew they were taking casualties, but they didn't know from where. Without a loud muzzle report to orient them, they were blind men in a shooting gallery. Up on the roof, Cooper finally heard the distinct clack hiss of Edwards working the bolt directly below him. "Contact!" Cooper's voice hissed through her earpiece, tight and confused. "Negative, Coop," Edwards whispered into her mic, her voice flat, devoid of adrenaline. She cycled the bolt again. Another round chambered. "Stay low, don't engage, you'll give away the angle." "Chief, what the hell are you shooting at?" Kessler's voice cracked over the net. He was awake now. She could hear the rustle of the team moving inside the room behind her. "Go back to sleep, LT," Edwards said. She found another heat signature trying to flank left, breaking cover to run across a small gap between boulders. She tracked his movement, gave him a foot of lead, and squeezed. Pfft! The running figure crumpled. "Edwards, report!" Kessler snapped, the authority returning to his gravelly voice. "Assault force, 19 personnel, make that 15, she said calmly. "They brought rockets. I'm handling it." She didn't look away from the scope. She felt Kessler crawl up beside her in the dark. He raised his own thermal monocular to the narrow slit. He drew in a sharp breath. Out in the dark, the hillside was littered with white-hot shapes. Some were still. Some were crawling frantically back the way they came. The assault was broken. The unseen, silent death raining down on them had shattered their nerve. They were abandoning the heavy weapons. They were abandoning their dead. Jesus, Kessler whispered. Don't shoot, Edwards repeated, tracking a man trying to drag a wounded fighter away. She let him go. A team carrying a wounded man moved slower, consumed more resources, and spread panic back at their base camp. She watched through the thermals for another hour. She didn't fire another shot. The remaining heat signatures faded over the ridgeline, disappearing into the vastness of the mountains. The cold finally seeped into her bones. She pulled the rifle back through the gap, clicked the safety on, and sat back on her heels. The room was silent again, but this time, nobody was sleeping. Kessler, Hancock, and the others were all awake, fully kitted out, staring at her in the dim light. The smell of burnt powder and hot brass hung heavy in the enclosed space. "You didn't sleep," Hancock said softly. It wasn't an accusation anymore. Edwards stood up, her joints popping. She slung the Mark 13 over her shoulder. The metal was still warm. "Like I said, Hancock," Edwards replied, walking back to her cot. "Rifle is your lifeline." Morning did not arrive with a gentle glow. It tore over the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush like a raw, infected wound, spilling harsh orange light into the valley. The temperature swung violently. The biting frost of the night evaporated, replaced immediately by a dry, suffocating heat that baked the mud brick walls of the compound. Nobody had gone back to sleep. Edwards sat exactly where she had been at dusk, on the overturned plastic crate. Her Mark 13 lay across her lap. She wasn't cleaning it this time. She was simply resting her forearms over the heavy barrel, staring at the scarred dirt floor. Lieutenant Diesel Kessler strapped on his plate carrier. The Velcro ripped loudly in the quiet room. He racked the charging handle of his M4, checking the chamber out of pure muscle memory. "Hancock Cooper," Kessler said. His voice was entirely devoid of its earlier fatigue. It was tight, professional. "With me. We clear the perimeter. Edwards, hold the room. Overwatch from the roof." She nodded once. She didn't offer a word, just slung the rifle and climbed the wooden ladder to the flat mud roof. The clay crumbled slightly under her boots. Up here, the wind was a physical force, hot and smelling of dust. She dropped prone behind a low parapet, scanning the hillside where she had worked hours before. Down below, Kessler and the two younger operators slipped through the compound's wooden gate. They moved in a staggered wedge, rifles up, heads on swivels. The valley was silent, not the predatory silence of the night, but the hollow, empty quiet of a graveyard. They reached the first body 200 yards out. From her perch, Edwards watched through the day optic. She saw Kessler stop, lowering his rifle slightly as he looked down. The dead fighter lay crumpled in a small depression. The .300 Winchester Magnum round had entered his upper chest and shattered his spine on exit. He had died instantly, dropping like a puppet with cut strings. A rusty AK-47 lay in the dirt near his outstretched hand. Kessler moved forward, kicking the weapon away. He signaled Hancock to cover while he checked the body. Nothing of intelligence value, no radio, just a chest rig full of worn magazines. They moved up the incline. 10 yards away lay the second body, then the third. When Kessler reached the spot where the squad leader had fallen, he stopped completely. He crouched. Edwards watched through the scope as the lieutenant picked something up from the dust. It was a heavy olive-drab tube, an RPG-7 launcher. Beside it lay a canvas bag containing 3 high-explosive fragmentation rockets. Kessler knelt there for a long time in the rising heat. He stared at the rockets, then turned his head to look back at the mud compound. He looked exactly at the small, uneven gap under the roofline where Edwards had set up her shot. 280 yards, if she had slept. if she had trusted the silence. Those rockets would have ripped through the unreinforced mud walls. They would have detonated in the enclosed room. The team wouldn't have even heard the blast that killed them. They would have just ceased to exist, turning into a mixture of pulverized clay and pink mist in their sleeping bags. Hancock stepped up beside Kessler. He looked at the launcher, then looked at the dead men scattered across the shale. The young operator's face was pale under the layer of desert grit. He swallowed hard, the movement visible all the way from the roof. They found 5 bodies in total. The rest of the assault force had fled, dragging whoever else they could carry, leaving deep drag marks and thick pools of drying, blackened blood in the dirt. Kessler didn't order them to police the enemy weapons. They didn't have the time or the weight capacity. He just stood up, kicked dirt over the RPG rockets, and keyed his mic. "Perimeter is clear," Kessler said over the radio. "Return to the structure. We pack up. Wheels up in 20. They walked back to the compound in absolute silence. When Edwards climbed down from the roof, her pack was already sitting by the door. Hancock had packed her sleeping bag. He had rolled it tight, tighter than he rolled his own, and secured it to the bottom of her frame. He stood near the door, checking his magazines. He didn't look at her when she walked in. "Thanks," Edwards said. Her voice was raspy, dry as the air outside. "Yeah," Hancock replied softly. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second. The patronizing doubt from the night before was completely gone, burned away by the reality of the sunlit hillside. "Good shooting, Chief." Kessler walked in, pulling his tactical sunglasses down over his eyes. He didn't give a debrief. He didn't pat her on the back. SEALs didn't deal in dramatic gratitude. Survival was the expectation. Failure was the anomaly. But the dynamic in the room had fundamentally shifted. The air was heavier, thicker, with a grim acknowledgement of how thin the line between breathing and bleeding really was. 18 kilometers to the LZ, Kessler said, pulling his map out. Terrain is entirely uphill for the first 6. Shale and loose rock. Sun's going to be a bastard today. Hydrate now. We don't stop unless we take contact. Edwards picked up her pack. It weighed 80 pounds. She hoisted it onto her shoulders, buckling the waist strap. The heavy Mark 13 hung across her chest, a bruising weight that she would carry in her hands for the next 10 hours. She didn't feel the fatigue yet. The adrenaline had faded, but it had left behind a cold, sharp focus. "Ready, LT," Edwards said. Kessler looked at her. He looked at the rifle slung across her chest. "Take point, Edwards," Kessler said. It was the ultimate sign of trust. In hostile territory, the point man dictates the life and death of the patrol. They find the tripwires. They spot the ambushes. Edwards nodded. She stepped out into the blinding Afghan sun, pulling her shemar up over her nose and mouth. The heat hit her like a physical blow, but she set her jaw, found the goat path leading south, and started to walk. By noon the valley was a convection oven. The temperature breached 110 degrees. The air shimmering off the rocks distorted the horizon, making the distant peaks dance and warp like a mirage. Edwards led the column up a steep, winding switchback. The ground was treacherous, brittle shale that snapped under their boots, sending miniature avalanches tumbling down the sheer drops to their left. Every step required thought. Every footfall was a calculation. Her legs burned. The muscles in her thighs screamed with lactic acid, and her shoulders were rubbed raw under the thick nylon straps of her pack. The Mark 13 felt like it weighed 50 pounds now. Her hands were blistered, but she kept her finger indexed above the trigger guard, her eyes scanning the ridgelines, the shadows, the caves. Behind her, she could hear the ragged breathing of the men. Nobody spoke. Talk wasted oxygen, and they needed every molecule just to keep moving forward. They were dehydrated. The water in their camelbacks was hot, tasting of plastic and iodine. They drank in small, disciplined sips, knowing the resupply was still hours away. The sun beat down on the backs of their necks, relentless and heavy. Edwards focused on the rhythm. Left foot, right foot, breathe in the dust, exhale the exhaustion. She didn't think about the men she had killed in the night. She didn't feel remorse, and she didn't feel pride. She felt the hollow, mechanical detachment required to do the job. They had tried to kill her team. She had stopped them. It was a brutal equation, solved with ballistics and gravity. But as the hours dragged on, the physical toll of her sleepless night began to collect its debt. Her vision blurred at the edges. Phantom movements flickered in her peripheral vision. A bush looking like a crouched fighter, a shadow looking like a rifle barrel. She blinked hard, forcing her eyes to focus, relying on her training to override her failing biology. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, using the sharp pain to anchor her to reality. At 1500 hours, they crested the final ridge. Below them lay a wide, dry riverbed. LZ'd Hawk. Edwards dropped to one knee behind a large boulder, bringing her rifle up to scan the valley floor. The heat waves made the optic nearly useless, but she checked every rock, every depression, every possible angle of attack. LZ in sight, Edwards whispered into her radio. Her throat was so dry it felt like it was packed with sand. Kessler moved up beside her. He looked through his binoculars, his chest heaving under his armor. He lowered the glass and looked at Edwards. Her face was hollowed out, her eyes bloodshot and ringed with deep, dark circles. She was running on absolute fumes. "Hold the perimeter," Kessler said, keying his long-range radio to contact the extraction bird. "Hawk Base, this is Outlaw 1-0. We are in position at the LZ, requesting extraction. Over." Static hissed in their earpieces, followed by the heavenly sound of a clear voice. "Outlaw 1-0, this is Hawk Base. We have your beacon. Inbound. ETA 5 mics." They waited. 5 minutes stretched into an eternity. Edwards didn't lower her rifle. She swept the ridgelines, her muscles trembling with fatigue, refusing to let her guard down until they were off the ground. Then they heard it. The deep, rhythmic thud of rotor blades slicing through the thin mountain air. 2 MH-47. Chinook helicopters crested the southern peak, hugging the terrain, flying impossibly low and fast. They flared over the riverbed, kicking up a massive cloud of dust, rocks and debris. The noise was deafening, a mechanical roar that drowned out the howling wind. The ramp of the lead bird dropped before the wheels even touched the dirt. A flight engineer in a Nomex suit leaned out, waving them in frantically. "Go, go, go!" Kessler yelled, slapping Edwards on the shoulder. She stood up, her knees popping, and ran. The rotor wash battered her, threatening to knock her off her feet, but she put her head down and charged up the ramp into the dark, vibrating cavern of the helicopter. Hancock and Cooper piled in behind her, followed by Kessler. The moment the lieutenant's boots hit the non-slip flooring, the ramp began to rise, and the massive aircraft banked hard, pulling up and away from the earth. Inside the bird, it was dark and loud. The smell of aviation fuel, hydraulic fluid, and hot metal filled the air. Edwards collapsed onto the canvas jump seat. She didn't unclip her gear. She didn't take off her helmet. She just leaned her head back against the vibrating fuselage and closed her eyes. The adrenaline finally vanished, leaving a sudden, crushing wave of exhaustion in its wake. Every bone in her body ached. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely keep them clamped around her rifle. Suddenly, a canteen was shoved into her chest. She opened her eyes. Kessler was standing over her, holding his personal canteen. He hadn't touched it during the hike. He had saved his water. She took it with a trembling hand, unscrewed the cap, and drank. The water was warm, but it felt like ice sliding down her raw throat. She handed it back to him. "Thanks, LT," she yelled over the deafening roar of the engines. Kessler took the canteen. He looked at her, his face a mask of dirt and fatigue. He glanced down at the Mark 13, still gripped tightly in her lap. He didn't smile. He didn't say anything profound. He just gave her a single, definitive nod. "Get some sleep, Chief," Kessler yelled back. "You earned it." Edwards looked across the cabin. Hancock and Cooper were already out, heads slumped against their chests, dead to the world. She looked back at her rifle. The metal was cool now. She finally flicked the safety on, let her head fall back against the vibrating wall of the helicopter, and for the first time in 3 days, allowed the darkness to take her. The truth about survival is that it rarely looks heroic. It usually just looks like staying awake when everyone else is asleep. Edwards didn't want a medal. She just wanted her team to make it home. If you felt the tension of that long, cold night in the Hindu Kush, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who appreciates real grit and subscribe for more deeply human stories from the front lines. What would you have done in her boots? Let me know below.